This is a brief introduction to the works in Floating Beauty, Women in the Art of Ukiyo-e. Welcome to the Pauly Friedman Art Gallery. This is your special tour of the exhibition, which closed on Sunday, March 11. In this class, we will be learning about the Edo period on or around April 9, which is less than a month from now, but this will be an interesting experiment for you to learn about 18th century Japan first, and then go into the Neolithic to pre-modern eras to see what historical holdovers may have taken place in regard to how these cultures viewed nature, relationships within Japanese society, and international relations. The works in this exhibition are from the permanent collection of the Reading Public Museum. In some cases, the works in the show, there may be more than one copy of that print somewhere in the world, but for others, it may be the only existent one. Nevertheless, each print is a unique work of art, as each of these is handmade, just as there are very subtle and sometimes undetectable differences between identical twins. It would be impossible to make two perfectly identical prints. The perspective of this particular show is to highlight the lives of women during the Edo period, but for the purposes of this class, I would like you to focus on how women in particular demonstrate the aesthetics of what was called the floating world. Your book in chapter 15 has a description of how ukiyo-e prints are made, and we're fortunate to have artist tools on display in the gallery in the glass case next to my office. These were made by publishing houses, and I've seen estimates for anywhere from 200 to 3,000 prints could be printed per day by a workshop consisting of artists, carvers, ink preparators, and printers. There is a modern strike made from a keystone block depicting a scene from the epic tale of 47 Ronin. Even though the works you see in the gallery today are quite colorful, a work consisting of just the black outline would have been considered a finished work. Color was a bonus selling point. That being said, color works could have as many as 6 different woodblocks carved, one for each color. Woodblock prints were very inexpensive to purchase at the time of their making. An estimated 8,000 prints of Hokusai's Great Wave of Kanagawa were printed by the publisher, and about 100 are documented in museum collections around the world. These were printed at a time when the class system, which the Japanese adapted from Chinese Confucian governmental systems, was strictly enforced. The samurai, which constituted about 6% of the population, were the highest class, followed by farmers, then artisans, then merchants. You had to be born into your class. When Japan was unified under one shogun, or military leader, heads of the smaller domains which had previously been at war with one another had to establish households in Edo, or modern-day Tokyo. This caused Tokyo's population to swell to over 1 million people by the 18th century, and merchants were thriving. But it was inappropriate for merchants to show off their wealth, and the samurai had no wealth to show off, which led to class tensions. A pleasure district was a licensed entertainment district, a neighborhood surrounded by a wall and then a moat with one gate allowing people in and out. Workers could not leave at night, and patrons could not stay the night. For the time you were in the pleasure district or floating world, you could temporarily enjoy life outside your station or economic circumstance. For a man to own a print of 2 women in an interior would have been quite pleasing, as all these images are the male fantasy of being entertained by women of the floating world. Which brings me to a note about terminology. Please, 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 do not substitute prostitute for geisha or courtesan. Use the correct terms. Women's roles may have included companionship and sexual favors, but they also provided entertainments that you could only enjoy while there. Remember, there's no recorded music at this time, so if you wanted to enjoy music, theater, poetry, etc., you had to be there. So in the back of this room, for example, there are 2 instruments, the koto and shamisen, and as you look through the gallery, please challenge yourself to look for indicators of activities that can only be enjoyed temporarily and in the moments spent in the Yoshiwara, the pleasure district of Edo. Not only was there a class system outside the walls, but inside the walls as well. There were different rankings of tea houses and courtesans. To be invited to a high-ranking tea house, you had to be entertained by a famous courtesan. You would have to demonstrate your understanding of refined culture. These prints helped distribute information about fashionable clothing, including hair accessories and cosmetics, as well as famous works of music or literature and even cultured mannerisms. Part of the duties of courtesans was to parade down the center street of the district with her attendants. Both men and women would line the streets to watch the procession and imitate the fashions, hairstyles, and accessories. While sumptuary laws prohibited merchant wives from wearing embroidered silk such as this, the textile industry was producing more elaborate stamped or printed fabrics that looked fancy but were not as expensive and therefore appropriate for the working class. In this work, for example, the artist Utagawa Kunisada assumes that his audience is familiar with the tale of Genji, a classic text of the tales of Japanese court life written 600 years earlier. As in the other works, the women's faces are meant to look very similar. Depicting women in this genre is about depicting the ideal qualities of a woman, and not necessarily an individual woman. Some of the indications of beauty and pleasure include the looseness of the lady's kimono as she's thinking about the appeal that Genji is making to her with the sacred tree, and you can see the label for that whole story. The kimono is especially loose around the neck, and the viewer certainly would have been aware that the back of the neck is an erogenous zone. This work includes even more text appealing to a more literate audience that would have been familiar with the poetry written in the print and been amused by the irony of the older poet in the corner and the young ladies in the foreground. In this scene by Hiroshige, just like in Hokusai's Wave of Kanagawa, we see the snow-capped Mount Fuji in the distance. Not everyone moved to Edo when the shogunate came to power, and villages such as this developed smaller economies of tea houses and other traveler services along the roads leading back to the samurai homelands. So women depicted in the Ukiyo-e were not only geishas or koto-sans, but ranged from the village laborer to upper-class wives. The other point that I want to make about Hiroshige is that he is using Renaissance perspective introduced to Japanese artists by Portuguese missionaries. People had to have permission to travel around Japan, and Europeans were prohibited from traveling to Japan except under very restricted conditions. So Japanese urban dwellers were not only increasingly literate from the rise of print culture, but also very curious about the world and interested in travel narratives. So for your assignment, the first part is just showing your work and sketching out your observations. So I expect it to include things like color, composition, anything about the figures, how many there are, whether there's space around them, what are their surroundings, are they in nature, are they in a room, is there just empty space around them, is there text and how is that text used, is it present or not present, is it in a cartouche or that box, or is it on an object like a fan or another furniture item, or is it floating freely, and what does that say about the work? Not having to read Japanese, of course, but trying to figure out what role text is playing in that work. And then any helpful information you pull from the label. So choose 2 or 3 items from the label that help you understand the work. One of those items may include the title if you find that helpful. And then in your prompt, you want to say, how is your chosen work representative of the floating world? And this is an assignment on Blackboard, so you don't have to write this down, but it's already on Blackboard. So your book uses a poetic description of the floating world based on literature. And it says, living only for the moment, turning our full attention to the pleasures of the moon, the snow, the cherry blossoms, and the maple leaves, singing songs, drinking wine, diverting ourselves and just floating, caring not a whit for the pauperism staring us in the face, refusing to be disheartened, like a gourd floating along the river current. This is what we call the floating world. Floating world takes its name from Buddhist beliefs, which we've discussed in class, as separate from the world. Buddhist works celebrate changes in time as part of this detachment, so you should be looking for indicators of the passage of time, such as seasonal representations, clothing, plants, or festivals or activities that take place during a certain time of year. And this is due next Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. And of course, let me know, as always, if you need an extension. Thanks and have a great day. We'll see you on Thursday.